Hey guys, welcome back to another slow trip through the distant past. Tonight, we're dimming the lights and heading back to one of the most overstated, over-dramatized, and, if we're honest, completely exhausting moments in history, the fall of Rome. Now don't worry, we're not going to sprint through battles or list every barbarian tribe like some kind of angry Latin quiz. No, tonight's pace is calm. Slow, gently tragic. The way Rome itself collapsed, not with a bang, but with centuries of confusion, bad decisions, and bread that kept getting smaller while the taxes got bigger. So, get comfortable. Maybe imagine you're reclining in a crumbling Roman villa, the marble floors cracked, the fountain long dry. Somewhere outside, a tired soldier is wondering why he hasn't been paid in 3 years. And in the distance, a new empire, or several, is already sharpening its axes. This is the story of how the world's most powerful civilization just kind of gave up. Let's start with the basic situation. By the late 4th century, Rome was tired. Not just politically tired, existentially tired. The empire had been running on fumes for centuries, bloated, overstretched, and deeply in debt. The borders were enormous. The army was expensive. The emperors were paranoid. And the average Roman? They were just trying to survive under an ever thicker mountain of bureaucracy. Imagine you're a Roman farmer in, say, Gaul. You're still paying taxes to Rome. You're still told you're part of this great empire. But in reality, your local governor hasn't seen Italy in his life. Your roads are full of bandits. And if you want protection, you have to bribe the local militia. The empire is still technically there. It's just not really functioning. It's kind of like if your computer was technically on, but only showing the spinning wheel of death. Now, Rome had been split into 2 halves, east and west, because running one gigantic empire across 3 continents was shockingly too much for one person. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, had money, trade, and a better defense system. The Western Empire, ruled from Rome and then Ravenna, had vibes. The West was basically an open-air museum of what Rome used to be, still impressive, but falling apart under the surface. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed. Some ruled for years, others for a few months before being murdered by their own guards. A kind of ancient HR problem that Rome never really fixed. Let's pause for a second and talk about those guards, the Praetorian Guard. They were supposed to protect the emperor. Instead, they spent about 2 centuries selling the throne to whoever paid them the most. There was one moment in 193 CE when they literally auctioned off the empire. Yes, you heard that right. They put the Roman throne up for sale, like an early version of eBay with swords. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus won the bid, promising a ridiculous payout to the soldiers. He became emperor. He lasted about 2 months, because, as it turned out, buying loyalty and keeping it were 2 very different things. So by the time we reach the late 4th and early 5th centuries, this same chaotic energy still lingers. Corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. Meanwhile, the borders were becoming porous. Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Franks, were all moving, migrating, and occasionally pillaging their way into Roman territory. Now, it's important to note, these weren't just wild barbarian hordes screaming into battle for fun. Most were displaced people, fleeing from something far scarier, the Huns. Imagine a chain reaction of migrations and panic, each tribe bumping into another, all the way to the Roman frontier. Rome tried to manage it with diplomacy, money, and the occasional sword. It didn't work. Let's zoom in on one of the more famous disasters, the sack of Rome in 410 CE. Led by Alaric, king of the Visigoths. It's one of those moments that history books highlight like it was the apocalypse. In truth, It was more like a very bad 3-day weekend. Yes, Rome was looted. Yes, people died. But by that point, Rome wasn't even the capital anymore. It was more symbolic, the idea of Rome being violated, the heart of empire exposed. Still, for the average Roman aristocrat, it must have felt like the universe was ending. For everyone else, the farmers, the slaves, the merchants, it was Tuesday. The empire had been unstable for so long that chaos felt almost normal. Meanwhile, religion was also changing everything. Christianity had gone from persecuted cult to state religion in less than a century. That's a lot of institutional whiplash. Old pagan temples closed down. Philosophers got suspicious looks, and emperors now styled themselves as defenders of the faith instead of conquerors of the world. This shift wasn't just spiritual, it rewired the empire's identity from a pragmatic, expansionist machine to something slower, more inward-looking, more bureaucratic. You can almost feel the empire sighing, putting down its sword and picking up a cross. Economically, things were bleak. Trade routes that once spanned the known world now fractured. Roads fell apart. Coinage was debased, meaning they kept reducing the silver content to stretch the treasury, which predictably made money worth less every year. If you were a merchant, your profits shrank. If you were a soldier, your pay was delayed. If you were a peasant, your taxes rose. Basically, everyone was miserable except for a handful of elite bureaucrats, still pretending everything was fine. And Rome loved pretending things were fine. Even as cities emptied, aqueducts dried up and local warlords took control. The imperial court in Ravenna continued holding ceremonies with golden robes, scripted speeches, and tired applause, because nothing says functional empire like good stage management. Let's take a breath. Imagine the world at this time. The Colosseum is half broken, its stones scavenged for building materials. Wild grass grows through the forum. Merchants haggle in half-empty markets. And far away, the Eastern Empire, in glittering Constantinople, looks on in quiet judgment. Rome is fading, but the idea of Rome refuses to die. Even as the empire dissolves, everyone, from Germanic kings to future popes, keeps calling themselves Roman in one way or another. It's almost poetic. The empire collapses, but the name outlives it. And so, by 476 CE, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer, nobody even bothers to fight back. There's no big battle, no last stand, just a quiet administrative reshuffling. Rome, once the master of the world, essentially gets conquered by its own mercenaries. The Western Empire is gone. The Eastern one survives. Slimmer, wealthier, calling itself Roman for another 1,000 years. But the old world has shifted forever. And that, in its slow anticlimactic way, is how Rome fell. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through decades of exhaustion. A tired civilization that forgot how to be what it once was. So, as we end this first part, picture that world again. A faded empire, cracked marble, tired soldiers, tax collectors who still show up even though the empire technically doesn't exist anymore. And far to the north, new kingdoms rising quietly from Rome's long shadow. We'll float into those next, the messy birth of medieval Europe, where everyone wanted to be Roman, but nobody quite managed it. Part 2. Life after the fall. Welcome to the middle of nowhere. Hey again, still awake? If so, congratulations. You've officially survived the collapse of Rome, which means you're now living in what historians politely call late antiquity, and what everyone else might call a centuries-long power outage. The empire's gone. The roads are falling apart. Your local government has vanished, Your currency is basically fancy metal junk, and the only people who still seem confident are bishops and bandits. So, yeah. Welcome to the early medieval world. The first thing you'd notice, as an average ex-Roman, is how quiet everything got. Gone were the crowds of Rome's bustling streets, the chariot races, the public baths, the noisy debates in the forum. Cities emptied out like someone had pulled the plug. Even Rome itself, the eternal city, shrank from over 1 million people to just a few tens of thousands. That's like modern-day Tokyo turning into a small town with goats in the streets, and honestly, there probably were goats in the streets. Without the empire's infrastructure, local life became small, self-contained, and very muddy. Trade routes vanished, so imported luxuries, silk, spices, olive oil, disappeared. People went back to living off the land. If you had a small farm, congratulations. You were now the backbone of civilization. Except you were also at the mercy of whoever had the most swords nearby. Because in the power vacuum left by Rome, every strongman, warlord, and ambitious general decided they were suddenly a king. It was kind of like when your teacher leaves the classroom and everyone starts declaring themselves in charge of the whiteboard, but with more axes. So let's talk about these kings. They weren't kings in the Roman sense. There were no crowns, no imperial offices, no elaborate ceremonies, at least not at first. Most of them were Germanic tribal leaders, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombards, who had once served as federati, or allied troops under Rome's payroll. And since Rome's paychecks stopped coming, they figured, why not just take the land instead? Practical, efficient, slightly rude. Let's start in Italy. After 476, the peninsula was ruled by Odoacer, technically a barbarian general, though he still pretended to serve the Eastern Roman Emperor out of politeness. That polite fiction lasted until Theodoric the Ostrogoth showed up around 488 and decided he wanted Italy instead. Theodoric was actually kind of impressive. He ruled like a Roman, repaired roads, restored aqueducts, and even kept the Senate around, though mostly for decorative purposes. His court in Ravenna tried very hard to keep Roman culture alive, down to the marble mosaics and purple robes. But let's be real, it wasn't Rome, it was a cosplay version of Rome. Elegant, yes, stable for a while, but deep down, everyone knew the empire was gone for good. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, North Africa had been taken over by the Vandals, and yes, they really leaned into that name. They sacked Rome back in 455, took the province of Carthage, and set up shop as pirates, raiding ships, collecting slaves, and generally being a nuisance to everyone. The Eastern Empire, now based in Constantinople, despised them, not just because they were pirates, but because they were also Arian Christians, meaning they followed a version of Christianity the Orthodox Church considered heresy, which, in those days, was like being the guy who shows up to a family dinner and insists the earth is flat. So yeah, the Vandals were not popular. Then there were the Franks, up in Gaul, modern-day France. They were one of the few barbarian groups that actually built something long-term. Led by a guy named Clovis, they managed to unify a big chunk of territory and, importantly, convert to Catholic Christianity instead of Arianism. That move gave them instant credibility with the Roman Church, which desperately needed new muscle after the empire's collapse. It was a political power-up, like switching teams in a video game and immediately getting better gear. The Franks became the church's favourite warlords, which would come in handy later when the Pope started handing out crowns. Across the Channel, the Roman province of Britain was having a full-scale identity crisis. Rome had pulled its legions out decades earlier, leaving the locals to deal with constant raids from Picts, Scots, and Saxons. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons moved in, invited at first as mercenaries, then staying as conquerors. The native Britons probably weren't thrilled, but their options were limited, and so the island turned from a Roman outpost into a patchwork of tiny kingdoms, each ruled by its own warlord with a suspiciously unpronounceable name. If you ever wondered why early British history feels like one long fever dream of kings named Ethel this and Ethel that, this is why. Daily life for the average person changed slowly but dramatically. Most people didn't wake up one day and say, "Ah yes, the empire has fallen." They just noticed fewer coins, fewer officials, and more local lords demanding taxes in the form of grain or labour instead of money. Peasants worked the same land their ancestors had, but now under different masters. Instead of an imperial tax collector, it was a local baron or bishop, same demands, different accent. Religion filled the vacuum that government left behind. The church became the only institution that still worked across borders, and it knew it. Bishops became political leaders. Monasteries turned into centers of education, agriculture, and medicine, and priests were often the only people who could read. Imagine trying to explain to a Roman senator from 100 years earlier that monks now held more power than generals. He'd probably choke on his wine. The Eastern Empire, now just called Byzantium by modern historians, looked westward and sighed. To them, the Western world had turned into one big chaotic yard sale of old Roman junk. They sent diplomats, missionaries, and the occasional army to help. But mostly they focused on surviving their own problems. Persians, plague, and a never-ending argument about theology. Culturally, though, things didn't disappear overnight. Latin lingered in law and religion. Roman engineering, though fading, still shaped cities and roads. Even fashion stuck around, tunics, cloaks, sandals. It's funny, the so-called dark ages weren't truly dark. They were dim, a long twilight where old light lingered just enough to remind everyone what had been lost. If you were alive then, you'd probably feel two things: exhaustion and confusion. Everything your grandparents told you about the glory of Rome would sound like a fairy tale, and yet you'd still live among its ruins, bathing in Roman baths that barely worked, sleeping under roofs built by slaves centuries earlier, praying in churches that used to be temples to Jupiter. It must have been strange, that feeling of living in the afterglow of greatness, like walking through a house after the party's over, with half-eaten bread on the table and candles still flickering. But life went on. People still farmed, married, argued, and dreamed. They still sang songs, told stories, and occasionally wondered what the world might look like 1,000 years from now. Spoiler, pretty different. As the centuries rolled on, the chaos would slowly settle into something new: kingdoms, languages, and cultures that would form the foundation of medieval Europe. But for now, in this early medieval haze, everything felt uncertain. The empire was gone, but its shadow still loomed. And everyone, from peasants to popes, was trying to figure out what came next. So as we drift out of part 2, imagine yourself in that world. A quiet countryside, broken roads, crumbling villas, and distant church bells echoing over the hills. The empire has fallen. But life, stubborn as ever, keeps going. Let's float forward next time into what those early medieval kingdoms became, and how Rome's ghost haunted them all for centuries. Part 3. The Church, the Franks, and the dream of Rome reborn. You've survived the empire's collapse, the warlords, and the goat-infested ruins. Now you're standing at the threshold of something new. A Europe that's slowly, awkwardly, trying to reinvent itself. There's no emperor in the West anymore. no legions marching in perfect formation, no marble forums echoing with speeches. But there's one thing that refuses to die, the idea of Rome. Even centuries after its fall, Rome still haunted everyone, every king, every bishop, every peasant. They all lived in its shadow. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was identity. If you ruled land, you wanted to call yourself Roman somehow, because that still meant civilization, order, legitimacy, and no one wanted to be seen as just another barbarian. Let's start with the only empire that technically never fell, the Eastern one. While the West crumbled, the Eastern Roman Empire, aka Byzantium, kept going strong from its glittering capital, Constantinople. To them, they weren't Byzantines. They were still Romans, the last ones standing. They spoke Greek, dressed differently, and loved theological debates that could last decades. But they saw themselves as heirs of Augustus and Constantine. They built cathedrals that touched the sky, like the Hagia Sophia, and watched the West with a mix of pity and superiority. In the West, though things were rougher, power was fragmented. If you zoomed out, Europe looked like a shattered mosaic, tiny kingdoms, each with its own rules, coins, and gods. But amid that chaos, one force started stitching the pieces together: the Church. The Roman Catholic Church became the glue that held the post-Roman world in place. Its bishops ran local politics. Its monasteries preserved what little knowledge survived. And its priests offered something no warlord could: hope. To the illiterate masses, the Church was magic. It offered salvation in a world that seemed cursed. Its rituals gave rhythm to the seasons. Births, marriages, harvests, deaths, all blessed and bound by the cross, and at the top of this spiritual pyramid sat the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Once just another bishop among many, he now began to act like the heir to the emperors, not with soldiers, but with scripture. If Rome couldn't rule with swords anymore, it would rule with faith. But the Church needed protection, and for that, it turned to the strongest new power in Western Europe, the Franks. You remember them from part 2, the ones who decided to convert to Catholic Christianity instead of Arianism. That one smart decision set them up for centuries of divine approval. Their leader, Clovis, ruled in the late 400s and early 500s. He united the Frankish tribes, conquered a ton of territory, and made Christianity his brand. When he was baptized, legend says thousands of his warriors followed him into the faith, a whole army reborn in the name of God. From that moment on, the Church and the Franks became best friends, and that alliance would shape the entire medieval world. Fast forward a couple centuries, and we meet Charles Martel, a Frankish ruler known as the Hammer. He never called himself king. He was technically just the mayor of the palace, but everyone knew who was really in charge. In 732, he defeated an invading Muslim army near Tours, halting their expansion into Western Europe. That battle, though often exaggerated, made him a legend. To the Church, Charles was a hero, God's chosen defender. To his descendants, it was the perfect excuse to start calling themselves kings. And then came his grandson, Charlemagne. Now here's where the story gets big again. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, wasn't just a king. He was a phenomenon. He ruled from 768 to 814, and under his leadership, the Franks built something Europe hadn't seen in centuries. A real, functioning empire. It stretched from France to Germany, from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He reformed the army, standardized laws, and encouraged education. Imagine that, a medieval king who cared about schools. He invited monks and scholars to his court, turning it into a small island of learning in a mostly illiterate world. That movement became known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a brief but brilliant revival of art, writing, and culture. It wasn't the glory of ancient Rome, more like a careful imitation done with rough tools and good intentions. But it mattered, because for the first time in hundreds of years, people believed civilization could return. Then came Christmas Day. The year 800, Charlemagne went to Rome, knelt before Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica, and during the service, boom, the Pope placed a crown on his head. The people shouted, "Long live Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-bringing Emperor of the Romans." In that instant, something ancient flickered back to life. The Roman Empire, reborn, at least in name. Charlemagne didn't ask for the title. Some say he was even annoyed by it, but it didn't matter. That moment sealed the bond between kings and the church. For the next 1,000 years, from then on, Western Europe had emperors again. Holy Roman emperors, to be exact. And whether or not it was truly holy or truly Roman, or even much of an empire, well, that's a debate historians still enjoy. Under Charlemagne's rule, Europe had a brief golden glow. Schools reopened, trade revived. Script was standardized. Monks began writing in a new, easier-to-read font called Carolingian minuscule, which eventually evolved into modern lowercase letters. If you're reading this in lowercase, you can thank Charlemagne's scribes, but like all golden ages, it didn't last. After his death, his empire split among his grandsons. They argued, divided, and weakened the realm, setting the stage for another wave of chaos, because the 9th and 10th centuries were about to bring a new kind of nightmare. Raiders. From the north came the Vikings, slicing across the coasts in sleek longships. From the south came the Saracens, Muslim raiders attacking the Mediterranean shores, and from the east came the Magyars, horsemen sweeping across the plains of Central Europe. The Carolingian Empire cracked under the pressure. Castles rose, towns fortified their walls, and local lords started defending their lands on their own. Once again, Europe fractured, this time into the feudal system. But even amid that turmoil, Charlemagne's legacy lingered. The idea that Western Europe could be united under one Christian emperor, the idea of a Holy Roman Empire, would echo for centuries. It became both a dream and a curse, inspiring rulers from Otto the Great to Napoleon. Everyone wanted to be the next Charlemagne. No one quite pulled it off. Meanwhile, the church kept growing in power. It crowned kings, excommunicated emperors, collected tithes, and dictated what people could or couldn't believe. It became, in many ways, the most organized government left in Europe. And by the year 1000, it ruled not just over souls, but over minds. The medieval world had taken shape, feudal, religious, and deeply convinced that everything happened according to divine will. Rome was gone. Yes, but its spirit, disciplined, ambitious, obsessed with order, lived on inside stone cathedrals and Latin prayers. If you were alive then, you might have believed the world was finally at peace again. Kings ruled, the church guided, and the peasants tilled their fields. The chaos of the Dark Ages seemed to be over. But, as history likes to remind us, peace in the Middle Ages never lasted long, because soon faith would turn into fire, and Europe would march east under the sign of the cross. Part 4. The Crusades and the Cult of Knighthood. Hey again. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived 3 centuries of crumbling empires, scheming bishops, and peasant revolts. You deserve a warm drink and a blanket, because now we're heading into one of the strangest, most contradictory chapters of medieval history. Time when deep faith mixed with deep violence, when men in heavy armor believed they were saving their souls by stabbing strangers thousands of miles away. Welcome to the Crusades. Let's ease into it. By the late 11th century, Europe was still a messy quilt of little kingdoms. The church was powerful, the nobles were restless, and the peasants were, well, still peasants. But something new was bubbling up beneath all that mud and incense, a sense of collective purpose. For centuries, Christendom had been on the defensive. Muslim empires controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and much of Spain. The Byzantine Empire, the old eastern half of Rome, was holding on, but barely. And in the West, the Church wanted a grand project to unite all those squabbling knights under one holy banner. Because, honestly, knights were a problem. Picture a knight in the 11th century. He's got expensive armor, a trained warhorse, and no one left to legally fight. He spends most of his time raiding neighbors, stealing cattle, and occasionally, accidentally burning down monasteries. The church hated this. So it came up with a brilliant marketing plan. What if, instead of killing each other, you went and fought for God, and somehow it worked? In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and gave one of the most effective speeches in history. He told the knights that Christians in the East were under attack, that the Holy Land had been seized by Muslims, and that God himself wanted them to take it back. He promised forgiveness of sins, eternal glory, and the spiritual equivalent of a VIP pass to heaven. To a medieval audience, that was irresistible, and so began the First Crusade. Now the word crusade comes from crux, meaning cross. Those who went on this holy journey sewed a red cross on their clothing. They weren't just warriors anymore. They were pilgrims with swords. Tens of thousands joined. Knights, peasants, nobles, monks, even entire families. It was chaos on legs. The trek to the Holy Land was long, brutal, and full of bad decisions. Food ran out, diseases spread, and many died before even reaching their destination. And yet, somehow, against all odds, the First Crusade succeeded. In 1099, the Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, capturing the city after a long siege. They slaughtered thousands, Muslims, Jews, even some Christians. The streets reportedly ran with blood, but the chroniclers called it a miracle. God's will, they said, had been done, and just like that, Western Europe had its first overseas colonies, the Crusader states. Small pockets of Latin rule carved into the Middle East. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. They were part fortress, part fantasy. Knights who settled there lived in castles that mixed European and Islamic architecture, traded with their supposed enemies, and developed a strange hybrid culture. For a while, it even worked. But peace never lasted in medieval history, and certainly not in the Holy Land. The Crusader states were fragile, constantly attacked by surrounding powers, and by the mid-1100s, Muslim leaders began to unite against them. One name rose above all others: Saladin. He was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a skilled general, but also a man who valued mercy and diplomacy, which made him the polar opposite of most Crusader lords. In 1187, Saladin's forces crushed the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and retook Jerusalem. Back in Europe, this caused collective panic. The Pope basically hit the all knights assemble button, and that gave us the Third Crusade, starring three of the biggest egos in medieval history: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. you might be expecting an epic story of unity and valor. Instead, what we got was bickering, dehydration, and accidental drowning. Barbarossa drowned crossing a river before even reaching the Holy Land. Philip II got sick of Richard's arrogance and went home, and Richard, well, he fought valiantly but couldn't recapture Jerusalem. He did, however, negotiate a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the city. Then he got kidnapped on his way home. Because of course he did. His ransom was so high that England had to basically sell the kingdom's furniture to pay it. But people still called him Lionheart because medieval PR was strong. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Crusades had transformed everything. Knighthood had gone from a local profession to a global calling. New orders emerged: the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, blending monastic discipline with military power. They were warrior monks, sworn to poverty, chastity, and mass murder in the name of Christ. The Templars, in particular, became absurdly rich. They invented early forms of banking, held fortresses across Europe, and answered only to the Pope. Basically, they were the medieval version of a multinational corporation, except holier and slightly more violent. The Crusades also opened trade routes, spread ideas, and reconnected Europe with the wider world. Silk, sugar, spices, and, importantly, knowledge flowed back from the East. Europeans rediscovered Greek philosophy, Arabic science, and mathematics. Without realizing it, they were planting the seeds of the Renaissance. So in a weird way, while knights were dying under desert suns, Europe was slowly waking up intellectually. But the spiritual high faded. Later crusades got messy, misguided, and frankly embarrassing. The Fourth Crusade never even reached the Holy Land. The Crusaders ended up looting Constantinople, a Christian city. Imagine declaring war on infidels and then accidentally sacking your own team. It was all downhill from there. By the 13th century, crusading had become less about piety and more about politics, profit, and revenge. There were crusades against heretics, crusades against pagans, even crusades against other Christians. The once holy mission turned into a franchise that nobody respected anymore. Still, for all its contradictions, the Crusades gave us one enduring image: the medieval knight as both sinner and saint. He prayed before battle, confessed afterward, and somehow believed both actions cancelled each other out. Knighthood itself evolved during this time. The Church began defining it as a moral vocation, chivalry, honour, defending the weak. It was partly real, mostly propaganda, because in truth, most knights were still brutal landlords collecting taxes at sword point. But stories of noble knights, fair ladies, and sacred quests were great bedtime tales for the nobility. So they stuck. By the 13th century, knighthood wasn't just a job, it was a culture. You had tournaments, jousts, courtly love poetry, and heraldry, the medieval version of personal branding. The knight was now the medieval ideal, strong, loyal, brave, and godly, even if, in real life, he mostly smelled of horse and regret. But under all that glittering armour, something else was changing. Kings were getting stronger, feudal lords were losing autonomy, and the Church, the once untouchable spiritual power, was starting to show cracks. As Europe grew richer and more organised, knights found themselves less relevant. Standing armies, crossbows, and later gunpowder would slowly make them obsolete. The age of the lone armoured hero was ending. But for now, in the warm haze of the 1200s, chivalry still reigned. a golden illusion before the next storm. Because soon, that illusion would crumble under plague, war, and despair. The medieval dream of faith and glory was about to collide with grim reality. Let's float gently toward that. Part 5. The Black Death and the Slow Collapse of the Medieval Dream. Hey, welcome back. If you've been listening in order, congratulations. You've now made it through crusades, empires, and at least 3 generations of knights who thought bathing was optional. Tonight, we're drifting into something quieter, darker, and yes, a little grimy, because the medieval world, for all its chivalric glitter and religious pageantry, was about to meet its match, not in battle, not in politics, but in biology. Let's talk about the Black Death, that polite little visitor that wiped out, roughly half of Europe. By the early 1300s, Europe actually looked kind of okay. Trade had returned, towns were growing, people were writing poetry, building cathedrals, and complaining about taxes again, all signs of a civilization that thinks it's stable. Farmers were producing enough food to feed the population, merchants were getting rich, and scholars were starting to rediscover classical knowledge. For a brief, deceptive moment, it almost looked like the medieval world had found its rhythm. And then, the rats showed up. Somewhere along the Silk Road, likely in Central Asia, a deadly bacterium called Yersinia pestis hitched a ride in the fleas of black rats. Merchants carried those rats aboard their ships, because apparently sanitation wasn't high on the list of medieval priorities. By 1347, a few of those ships docked in Sicily. Within weeks, ports all over the Mediterranean were infected, and from there it spread like wildfire. Within a year, it reached France. A few months later, England, then Germany, Scandinavia. Eventually, it wrapped the entire continent in a slow, suffocating panic. They called it the Great Mortality. The term Black Death would come later, and there was no understanding of germs or bacteria, of course. People thought it was God's punishment, bad air, or maybe even the alignment of the planets. Some blamed foreigners, some blamed witches, some blamed cats, which, ironically, only made things worse because cats killed the rats. It was, in short, the perfect storm of ignorance and despair. Symptoms appeared fast: fever, chills, black boils the size of eggs, people coughed blood, delirium set in, and death usually followed within days. Doctors wore those long, bird-like plague masks stuffed with herbs, less for science and more for psychological comfort. And honestly, who could blame them? In cities, corpses piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Whole families vanished in a week. Church bells rang constantly, until there was no one left to ring them. If you walked through a medieval town in 1349, you'd have seen shuttered homes, abandoned markets, and priests mumbling last rites through door cracks. The world had turned into one long, quiet funeral. And yet, life went on. It always does somehow. Those who survived found themselves in a new, strange Europe. Emptier, yes, but also freer. Labour was suddenly valuable. For the first time in memory, peasants could demand better wages. Landowners were desperate for workers, and entire social structures began to wobble. Feudalism, that grand system of lords and vassals, started to crack under the pressure of supply and demand. The survivors, mostly younger, stronger workers, realized they didn't need to serve forever. They could move, negotiate, even leave their manors. It wasn't a revolution in the modern sense, but it planted the seeds for one. The Black Death, in its horror, quietly rearranged society. Of course, the church didn't come out looking great either. For centuries, it had been the unquestioned guide of life and death. But when the plague came, prayers didn't work. Masses didn't stop the dying, and the clergy died just as quickly as everyone else. People began to wonder, if the priests can't protect us, maybe they aren't as close to God as they said. Faith didn't disappear, but it changed. It became more personal, less institutional, more desperate, more mystical. New movements popped up. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves, believing their suffering might earn divine mercy. Others turned to superstition, relics, and prophecies. It was a spiritual free-for-all. The medieval mind cracked open, and something new started to leak out. And just when Europe was recovering from the plague's devastation, war came knocking again, because apparently the continent just couldn't help itself. In 1337, right before the plague actually, England and France had decided to begin what would eventually be called the 100 Years' War. Because when you're medieval, you can't just fight a war, you have to make it a century-long lifestyle. The reason? Land, crowns, and pride. Basically, the usual. It all started when the French king died without a direct male heir. The English king, Edward III, claimed the throne through his mother. France said absolutely not. So Edward did what kings do best, declared himself King of France anyway, and started an invasion. The war would drag on for around 116 years, but not continuously. It came in waves, like a particularly toxic relationship that neither side could quit. And it was during this war that the medieval knight, that shining symbol of chivalry, met his downfall. You see, knights were trained for close combat. They wore heavy armor, fought on horseback, and relied on shock tactics. It worked great when you were fighting other knights, but not so great when the enemy was a bunch of English peasants with longbows. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English archers slaughtered French cavalry from a distance. It wasn't noble, but it was effective. The same thing happened at Poitiers and later at Agincourt. Knights charged into a storm of arrows and mud, slipping in their own pride. And slowly, everyone realized that valor was no match for physics. Chivalry was dying on the battlefield. But let's not get too dramatic. Even as the old warrior class faded, new icons rose. One of them was Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who claimed God told her to save France. In 1429, she convinced the Dauphin, the French heir, to let her lead troops. Against all odds, she lifted the siege of Orléans and helped turn the war's tide. Then, of course, she was captured, tried for heresy, and burned alive at 19. Because the Middle Ages loved a good martyr story. Centuries later, the church would make her a saint. Better late than never, I guess. By the time the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, both countries were exhausted. France had finally driven out the English, and Europe was changing again. Gunpowder was now a thing. Castles that had stood for centuries were becoming obsolete. Professional armies replaced feudal levies, and kings, real centralized kings, began to tighten their grip on power. The medieval world of scattered lords, armored knights, and divine monarchies was giving way to something new. The early modern age was peeking over the horizon. But before we drift too fast into the Renaissance, it's worth pausing. Because in the ashes of plague, war, and chaos, people started thinking differently. They questioned authority. They read. They painted. They asked, what if we just didn't live in constant fear? The Middle Ages didn't just end. They evolved. Out of death came curiosity, out of suffering, perspective. That's the strange thing about history. Even the worst times leave behind something quietly meaningful. So, as we leave this plague-ridden century behind, let's float gently into a new dawn. A world of printing presses, humanism, and, yes, a few more royal meltdowns, because Europe can never fully let go of drama. But for now, close your eyes, breathe slow, and imagine the bells of a half-empty village ringing faintly over misty fields. The Black Death has passed, and somewhere, someone is starting over. Part 6, The Renaissance, Constantinople, and a world reawakening. Welcome back if you're still awake. By now, you've travelled through the fall of Rome, the rise of the Church, Crusades, the Black Death, and the 100 Years' War. You might be thinking, can medieval Europe actually get any weirder? The answer, as always, is yes. Because now we're drifting into a period historians call the Renaissance, a slow, uneven reawakening of Europe after centuries of disease, war, and mud. Think of it as civilization yawning, stretching its limbs and saying, maybe we can try this whole art and science thing again. The Renaissance didn't happen all at once. It started in Italy in the 14th century, in cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan. Why Italy? Well, partly geography. Italy was a hub for trade with the East merchants. Bankers and scholars were constantly exchanging goods, ideas and gossip, and partly because Italian city-states were fiercely competitive. Nothing fuels innovation like neighbourly rivalry, especially when that rivalry involves spending lavishly on marble, palaces and public fountains. The heart of this awakening were a few key ideas: rediscovery of classical texts, curiosity about the natural world, and of course, slightly excessive self-confidence. Humanism became the guiding philosophy. Instead of focusing solely on God and the afterlife, people began to explore what humans could do, intellectually, artistically and politically. Artists, architects, and thinkers began producing work that would make a medieval peasant blink in awe. Painting moved from flat, symbolic images to realistic portraits. Sculptures grew more lifelike. Buildings rose with classical columns, domes and arches, like Rome had never really left. One cannot mention the Renaissance without a few names. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was obsessed with observing, sketching, and sometimes inventing things that would never work in real life. But the curiosity itself was revolutionary. Michelangelo sculpted figures that seemed to breathe under marble skin. Raphael painted scenes of elegance and serenity that suggested humans could, at least in art, reach perfection. These artists, of course, were often patronized by the same church that had once terrified Europe with plague and excommunication. The paradox is delicious. The institution that had preserved knowledge through darkness now funded some of the brightest achievements of light. Meanwhile, north of the Alps, scholars were translating and printing. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, made books more accessible. No longer did manuscripts need to be copied by hand in monasteries. Now ideas could travel quickly, widely, and without clerical oversight. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't just for nobles and monks. It reached merchants, lawyers, and curious peasants. And slowly, people began to think for themselves. A dangerous notion if you were a king or a bishop. But the Renaissance wasn't just about art and science. It also arrived amid significant geopolitical shifts. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire, that last remnant of Rome we've been talking about since part 2, finally fell to the Ottomans. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, was taken after a long siege, and Emperor Constantine V died defending it. The city became Istanbul, and suddenly Europe's eastern gateway to trade with Asia was under Ottoman control. This disruption pushed Europeans to search for new routes, eventually leading to exploration, conquest, and global empires. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, kings were consolidating power. France, Spain, and England were forming stronger monarchies. Feudal lords still existed, but centralized authority was growing. Nations as we recognize them today were slowly emerging from the fog of medieval fragmentation, and somewhere, in a quiet workshop or library, someone was beginning to ask questions that would eventually spark the scientific revolution. Questions about the natural world, human anatomy, and the movement of planets. But the Renaissance was not entirely peaceful. Religious tensions simmered. The Catholic Church, despite its wealth and patronage of the arts, faced criticism for corruption and worldliness. Preachers like Jan Hus and later Martin Luther would eventually challenge the Church. But for now, the cracks were only beginning to appear. Even monarchs were not entirely benevolent. Wars of succession, territorial disputes, and local rebellions persisted. Europe was awakening, but it was still messy, slow, and occasionally terrifying. For the average person, life remained difficult. Peasants still tilled the fields, merchants still risked life and limb on trade routes, and disease lingered. But for the first time in centuries, there was a sense of possibility: art, literature, science. These things offered a new kind of richness, beyond mere survival. In the streets of Florence, you could see scholars debating ancient texts. In Venice, merchants traded not only spices but ideas and innovations. And in quiet corners, artisans and inventors tinkered with objects that might one day change the world. So, as we drift toward the end of part 6, picture this. A city bathed in warm sunlight, marble facades glowing, scholars reading by candlelight, artists sculpting and painting, and streets buzzing quietly with possibility. The Middle Ages are fading, but their echoes linger: castles, cathedrals, knights, and the ever-present shadow of the past. Europe is waking up. Slowly, unevenly, sleepily. And the world that emerges will be familiar, yet completely new. Part 7, The Reformation, Nation-states, and the Twilight of Medieval Habits. Welcome back. By now, if you've stayed with me through the fall of Rome, the Crusades, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the Renaissance, you're probably feeling like a medieval scholar yourself. Tired, slightly dusty, and oddly fascinated by old architecture. Let's keep drifting, shall we? The 16th century arrived quietly at first, but it carried a storm. The Church, still the ultimate authority in Europe, had grown wealthy, ornate, and a bit arrogant. Popes lived in palaces that rivaled kings, collected gold, and sometimes engaged in scandalous behavior. Meanwhile, the average European peasant prayed, tithed, and hoped that God wouldn't smite them for stepping on the wrong patch of soil. It was, in short, a perfect recipe for rebellion. Enter Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk who, let's be honest, was just fed up. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. They weren't a modern manifesto exactly, more like a very polite medieval complaint letter, but they hit the mark. Luther criticized indulgences, corruption, and the church's tendency to treat salvation like a luxury commodity. And because the printing press existed by this point, his ideas spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Europe was debating theology in taverns, markets, and universities. The church, used to unquestioned authority, was shocked. They had lost the monopoly on religious truth. The Reformation splintered Europe into factions: Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia. All these regions picked sides. Some supported Luther, some remained loyal to Rome, and others were just trying not to get burned at the stake. The political consequences were enormous. Kings and princes realized they could use religion as a tool to consolidate power. Suddenly, faith was not only personal, it was political, national, and occasionally lethal. Meanwhile, in France and England, kings were building stronger states. Henry VIII of England famously broke from the Catholic Church in the 1530s, partly out of spiritual concern, partly because he wanted a divorce. And so the Church of England was born, giving the king both spiritual authority and control over English wealth. France, Spain, and the Habsburg territories were busy doing their own thing, expanding power, collecting taxes, and occasionally reminding peasants that life was still mostly about obedience and work. Across Europe, the old medieval habits lingered. Knights still jousted in tournaments, although their battlefield relevance was fading. Peasants still followed the agricultural calendar, sowing and reaping with medieval precision, and festivals, fairs and markets continued to mark the rhythms of life, bridging centuries of tradition. But the world was changing. Gunpowder and cannons made castles obsolete. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Diplomacy became a game of paperwork, not just swords. Education expanded too. Universities, which had existed since the 12th century, began to flourish. They taught law, medicine, philosophy, and eventually science. Latin was still the language of scholarship, but vernacular languages were making a comeback. By the end of the 16th century, people could read, write, and question authority in ways unimaginable to their medieval ancestors. Of course, all of this was messy. Wars continued, often motivated by religion, power, or money. Spain and Portugal raced to explore the globe, colonizing the Americas and establishing empires fueled by both greed and divine justification. Europeans brought new crops, animals, and, tragically, disease to the New World, forever reshaping the planet. Back home, cities grew, merchants prospered, and culture thrived. But the shadow of the medieval past remained. Cathedrals still dominated skylines. Feudal hierarchies still existed, even if slightly weakened, and superstition never truly died. By the late 16th century, Europe was a mix of old and new. Knights, in ceremonial armor, might parade through a town where merchants traded exotic goods from the Indies. A peasant might still pray to saints, while using a telescope to observe the heavens. Galileo's invention, hinting at new truths. The medieval world, with its castles, plagues, and crusades, hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved, and its influence lingered in laws, customs, architecture, and the human imagination. So, as we drift toward the early modern period, imagine Europe as a patchwork of contradictions, faith and skepticism side by side, tradition and innovation entwined, nobility still obsessed with honor and appearance, while commoners quietly learned that survival sometimes meant questioning everything. The Middle Ages were ending, but their lessons, their habits, and their absurdities would echo well into the future. Part 8. Exploration. Reformation ripples and the last echoes of chivalry. Welcome back. If you're still drifting along, congratulations. You've survived centuries of plague, war, and really questionable hygiene. Now, we're heading into a time when Europe finally starts poking its nose beyond its borders. And when the old medieval world begins its slow, reluctant fade into modernity. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were defined by a new obsession: exploration. Europeans had exhausted their immediate neighborhoods. Trade with the East was still lucrative but risky, so why not sail into the unknown? Spain and Portugal led the charge. Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal had already been funding expeditions along Africa's coast, and in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, aiming for India and finding, well, the Caribbean instead. The age of exploration was born. Exploration wasn't just about maps and spices. It was about prestige, profit, and faith. Every voyage promised new lands to claim, new peoples to convert, and new resources to extract. Europe was beginning to see itself as the center of a much larger world. And, of course, it wanted to dominate it. Meanwhile, back home, the Reformation continued to ripple. Protestant ideas spread across Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of France. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, a movement to reform itself and reassert authority. Jesuits, Inquisitions, and new religious orders appeared, balancing education, missionary work, and sometimes a slightly excessive zeal. Europeans were now deeply divided, not just by politics but by faith. Wars of religion became common. The French Wars of Religion, for example, pitted Catholics against Huguenots for decades, all while nobles and monarchs tried to maintain power. Through all this, the old knights and chivalry persisted. At least ceremonially, tournaments and jousts were still popular among nobility, even though real warfare had moved beyond heavy armor and lances, gunpowder, cannons, and professional armies had rendered traditional knights nearly obsolete on the battlefield. Yet the idea of chivalry, honor, loyalty, courtly love lived on. It became a social code, an idealized memory of the medieval past, more about pageantry than practical combat. Meanwhile, monarchs grew stronger. Spain unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, who financed Columbus and completed the Reconquista. England's Tudors consolidated power after the Wars of the Roses. France continued centralizing authority. Europe was moving toward modern states, where kings held real administrative power, collected taxes efficiently, and maintained standing armies. The printing press played a role here too. Books spread ideas faster than ever. Travelers' tales described distant lands, maps improved, people started questioning traditions and exploring science, alongside faith. Life for ordinary people, however, remained rooted in the past. Peasants still farmed, merchants still traded, and religious festivals continued to punctuate the year. Superstitions lingered, folk medicine persisted, and the church still dominated moral life. But the seeds of change were growing. Better navigation, wider trade, religious questioning, and centralized authority all hinted at a Europe increasingly awake and self-aware. By the end of the 16th century, the world had expanded. Europe was not only looking inward, but outward, across oceans, and into new continents. Science, exploration, and political consolidation were slowly eroding the medieval order. The castles and cathedrals remained, but their role in daily life was transforming. The Middle Ages weren't exactly dead yet, but they were quieting down. The ideals of knighthood, the rhythms of feudal life, and the unquestioned power of the church were fading into tradition and nostalgia. So, as we drift toward the 17th century, picture Europe as a continent standing at a threshold, its past still visible in stone walls, manuscripts and ceremonial nights, its future emerging in voyages across the seas, scientific curiosity, and religious debate. The medieval world had given Europe its structure, culture, and rhythm. Now it was slowly giving way to modernity. One discovery, one printing press, and one bloody religious conflict at a time. Part 9. The 30 Years' War. Science and the fading medieval world welcome back, If you're still drifting along with me, by now, we've covered centuries of knights, plagues, crusades, and the slow awakening of Europe. Tonight, we drift into a period that's less about pageantry and more about chaos. The early 17th century, when Europe's old medieval habits collided with the emerging modern world. The first stop on our slow, sleepy journey is the 30 Years' War. It began in 1618 in the Holy Roman Empire, though technically it could have started decades earlier if anyone had been paying attention. The war started as a religious dispute between Protestants and Catholics, but quickly expanded into a full-scale continental mess. All the major European powers got involved: Spain, France, Sweden, Denmark, the Habsburgs, the Dutch, and a few opportunistic mercenary companies that were probably just there for the pay. The war was devastating. Armies marched across Europe, pillaging towns, taking food, and leaving villages abandoned. Diseases, hunger, and famine followed. Estimates suggest that some regions of Germany lost up to half their population. It was, in essence, another Black Death, but with more gunpowder, uniforms, and paperwork. Yet for all its horror, the war also marked a turning point. Europeans began realizing that states needed strong governance, professional armies, and diplomacy to survive. Feudal lords could no longer dictate the terms of war. Centralized monarchs and organized bureaucracies were becoming the new norm. And while Europe was tearing itself apart, something quietly remarkable was happening elsewhere. The scientific revolution, curiosity, which had been simmering since the Renaissance, started to boil. Figures like Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, and Francis Bacon were questioning the natural world, challenging ancient authorities, and insisting that observation and reason mattered. Galileo looked to the skies, discovering moons orbiting Jupiter and the phases of Venus. Kepler formulated laws of planetary motion, slowly replacing Ptolemaic astrology with heliocentric clarity. And Bacon, well, he wrote a lot about methodology, experimentation, and the idea that humans could systematically learn from nature, basically the blueprint for modern science. All of this was terrifying to some people. The church, still powerful, tried to contain new ideas. Galileo's trial in 1633 reminded everyone that questioning authority could have consequences. Yet, the momentum was unstoppable. The medieval worldview, earth-centered, divinely orchestrated, unquestionable, was quietly being replaced. Meanwhile, the old knights and their ideals were fading fast. Armor was now mostly ceremonial. Lances and swords had given way to muskets and cannons. Chivalry remained an aspirational ideal, expressed in literature and courtly behavior, but it no longer dictated the battlefield. Even monarchs adopted new military strategies. Standing armies, trained by discipline rather than birthright, became standard. Mercenaries were organized, paid, and less likely to plunder their employers. Mostly. Culturally, Europe was transforming. The Baroque period emerged, characterized by grand art, architecture, and music designed to inspire awe, but also subtly reinforce the power of kings and the church. Think gilded ceilings, enormous statues, and music that swelled so dramatically it practically demanded you feel something. The contrast with the quiet, muddy, candlelit medieval world couldn't have been starker. By the mid-17th century, the medieval rhythms of life, feudal obligations, nightly tournaments, serfdom were no longer central. The world was faster, more connected, and more complicated. Print, science, and exploration had expanded knowledge. Professional armies had changed warfare, and religious authority, while still powerful, was no longer unquestioned. Yet, the echoes of the past persisted. Castles remained, Though often more picturesque than functional, noble titles retained prestige. And the medieval imagination, with its myths of knights, saints, and heroic quests, continued to influence art, literature, and social ideals. Even as Europe became modern, it never completely abandoned its history. The Middle Ages were fading, but they left a skeleton of culture, law, and memory that would carry forward. So as we drift toward the 18th century, imagine Europe as a continent caught between worlds. The knights of old are ceremonial ghosts. The church is powerful but questioned, and human curiosity is expanding into realms previously imagined impossible. The medieval world is fading, softly, unevenly, and inevitably, replaced by a Europe that looks and feels different, but carries all of its history in the shadows. Part 10. The Enlightenment and the Dawn of Modern Europe. Welcome back for the final drift, if you've stuck with me this long. By now, you've travelled through the collapse of empires, crusades, plagues, revolutions, and centuries of knights, kings, and curious scholars. Europe, by the early 18th century, had changed almost beyond recognition, but it still carried whispers of the medieval world in its architecture, customs, and imagination. The 17th century had taught Europeans many lessons. Wars were devastating. Religion could unite, divide, or destroy. Science and curiosity were unstoppable, and centralized monarchies were stronger than ever. The 18th century, however, would introduce a quieter but equally revolutionary force: the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was, at its core, an age of ideas. Philosophers, writers, and scientists began asking questions that were once dangerous or unthinkable. How should societies be governed? What are natural rights? Can humans improve themselves and the world through reason? Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, John Locke, and Montesquieu argued for tolerance, rational government, and freedom of thought. They weren't waving swords or building castles. They were writing, publishing, and quietly reshaping how people understood authority, morality, and law. Meanwhile, science had matured. Isaac Newton described the laws of motion and gravity, something that literally explained why apples fall and planets orbit. His work built on centuries of observation and experimentation. From the Renaissance to the scientific revolution, Europeans could now see the universe as something orderly, predictable, and understandable, a far cry from the medieval cosmos of divine whim and superstition. Culture continued to flourish. Music, art, and literature became increasingly secular and expressive. Composers like Bach, Handel, and later Mozart elevated music to a reflection of human emotion and intellect, rather than solely religious devotion. Architecture embraced symmetry, clarity, and elegance, a deliberate contrast to the shadowed mystery of Gothic cathedrals. And yet, despite all these changes, the shadows of the medieval world persisted. Nobility still held land and influence. Kings and queens remained powerful symbols of authority. Knighthood existed in ceremonial orders and honorary titles. Even everyday life bore medieval echoes. Markets, festivals, guilds, and religious customs continued to structure daily existence. People still prayed, celebrated saints' days, and followed seasonal cycles that hadn't changed in centuries. But fundamentally, Europe was now a different place. Exploration had connected continents. Printing and literacy spread ideas faster than ever. Science challenged superstition. Governments became more centralized and bureaucratic. In other words, the medieval world had transformed into the early modern world, a Europe where reason, curiosity, and ambition would dominate the next few centuries. And yet, when we look back, the medieval past remains surprisingly close. Every Gothic cathedral, every castle ruin, every tale of knights and kings carries the memory of centuries that shaped Europe. Even as the Enlightenment thinkers dreamed of rational societies and natural rights, they inherited the structure, struggles, and imagination of a world built on mud, iron, faith, and blood. So, as we close this sleepy journey, picture Europe as a continent at rest yet restless. The Middle Ages, with all their darkness, chaos, and charm fading behind, while a new world emerges, filled with science, ideas, and possibilities. The knights are ceremonial ghosts. The church is questioned but still present, and humanity, always curious, sometimes foolish, often slow, is ready to begin anew. So dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let the echoes of medieval Europe settle in your mind. Think of stone castles bathed in mist, candlelit cathedrals, and the slow, quiet rhythm of centuries past. And know that even as the world moves forward, those centuries of knights, kings, plagues, and scholars remain the foundation of everything that comes next.